An introduction to medical terminology. So a lot of medical terminology derives from Latin and Greek languages. So at first, when you're learning medical terminology, it feels like you're learning a foreign language. And that's because really it is. But just like any other language, there's actually a set of rules that it adheres to. And we're going to start in this slideshow to begin to develop that understanding of these rules that are in play in this language. So, one rule that's really important to keep in mind as paramedics is that medical terminology should only be used when we're communicating with other people that we expect understand medical terminology. So, for example, we'd use medical terminology when we're communicating with nurses and doctors at the receiving emergency department. However, you won't use medical terminology with members of the public, bystanders that might be at your scene, or your patient. In fact, using medical terminology when you're explaining things to patients can increase their fear because it can create a situation where they don't really understand what you're talking about. So, any reassurances that you're giving them, they won't necessarily even be able to understand. So, it's really important as paramedics that you be prepared to go between languages, using medical terminology when it's appropriate, but reverting to plain language when the need arises so that other people that are not healthcare professionals can understand what you're talking about. So, as I mentioned, this is basically a language that has rules. One of the rules is that there are different components within the words. So, we're going to start looking at these different components and what they are and how they can help us to understand medical terminology. So, we've got a series of different component parts that occur within medical terms. There's a prefix, a root, a combining vowel, and a suffix. Now, the prefix is only attached to certain words. We'll look at a few examples of those later on, but not all words have prefixes. Typically, all words will have roots, all words will have suffixes, and there's either a combining vowel in there or there's some kind of language rule that has us dropping that combining vowel, which we'll talk about in a minute. So when we're talking about these combining vowels, they actually have no meaning. They're just added in there to give the word a flow. And they're the only part of the word that doesn't have a meaning. All of these other component parts will contribute to the meaning of the word. So typically you'll see O being used as the combining vowel. We do see the combining vowel being dropped if the suffix, which is typically what's coming at the end of the word, starts with a vowel. So an example of a suffix that we're going to actually talk extensively about in this presentation is itis, which means inflammation. So you can see this suffix actually begins with a vowel, right? The letter I is a vowel. So when this is attached to a root to create medical term, we're actually going to drop the idea of having a combining vowel because this suffix, it comes along, it's bringing its own vowel, right? It's coming along with a vowel. So we don't have to give it one because it came prepared with its own, okay? So a combining form is something that we create when we put together a root and a combining vowel. So on the screen here, we have a few examples of different roots and they are attached to a combining vowel. So these are all combining forms. So the first one up on the screen, this likely will have a familiar root to all of you. So abdomen, right? Abdomen. I'm sure all of you watching this know what our abdomen is, right? So kind of in that stomach area of the body, not just the stomach, because in medical terminology, that has its own word, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but that abdominal cavity, right? And so you can see that that's combined with a vowel. It's got an O on the end, right? Abdomino. So this then becomes a combining form, okay? And like I said, that's referring to the abdomen. So we have another example here, broncho. This is referring to the bronch is referring to the bronchial tubes, And then again, the O, it doesn't have a meaning. It's just a combining vowel, making things sound better, right? Our next example that we have up on the screen, cranial. So the crani is referring to the skull, right? Again, the O just to sound good. That's all it's there for. So if we look at our next slide, here's an example of those combining forms broken up so that you can see the root and the combining vowel. So we've got that slash in between the root and that combining vowel. And we're going to use this pattern of having a slash separate the different components of the medical terminology on our slides so that as we're looking at the different examples, you can see the difference between the component parts. So when we're analyzing medical terms, we're actually going to start at the end of the word. So you can start at the beginning trying to figure out what the different component pieces are, but when you're trying to figure out the overall meaning, you're actually going to start at the end, right? So you may remember that we discussed that the end of those words is called a suffix, right? So you're going to start with the suffix when you're analyzing the meaning. Just hold that in your mind. We're going to come back to that concept when we have a few examples up on the screen. First, I want to talk to you guys more about these suffixes. So the suffixes, these are occurring at the end of a word. They clarify what medical terms are talking about. So we'll see this again in some of the examples coming up. This is why we're starting at the end, because it actually provides a fair bit of clarification. And these exist in all medical terms, right? So I mentioned previously that some medical terms have a prefix and some don't. All medical terms will have a suffix. So we have an example of some at the bottom here, itis, right, which is one that I already mentioned, which means inflammation. We've got ectomy, right, which means a removal of. We've got logi, and this is one that, again, likely everyone listening to this is familiar with logi. You've probably studied biology, right? So biology is actually an example of a medical term, one that we're familiar with. We sort of take it for granted, but we can break it up the same way, right? So we have the bio, which is referring to living, and then we have the logi, which is the suffix referring to the study of. So biology, in fact, is the study of life, right? A couple more examples here. We've got scope and plegia, and we're actually going to come back to that plegia in a little bit. So as part of your medical terminology learning, you certainly will need to utilize your textbooks as well as other resources that are available in order to memorize the different suffixes, in order to memorize the different roots. And the more that you work with this, the easier it'll become. So I highly recommend doing the exercises in the textbook that accompany the different presentations that we're talking about in class. And yeah, that's a bit of committing it to memory. But once you've committed it to memory, you then have the capacity to put those pieces together and understand any new word that you encounter. So it's well worth that initial upfront effort. And by using the terms, by using them in your lab class, by hearing them in your other classes, by reading them in your textbooks, you will become more and more familiar. So as you're encountering new medical terms, go back to this idea of breaking them into their component parts, developing an understanding of those component parts, and then through that, figuring out what they mean, right? Just like really like what I just did with biology. So let's talk about these root words a little bit. So generally the root words are referring to a body part. Typically, there's at least one in a medical term, but there can be more. In fact, we're going to look at a couple of examples coming up in the slideshow where there's more than one root word involved. Got a couple of examples here on the slide. Again, one that would be super familiar to most of you guys. So Arthur, right? Most of you guys have heard of arthritis, right? So we've already established that that a suffix that is quite commonly used in medical terminology is itis, right? Which refers to swelling. Arthur refers to the joints. So when we put those two together, we've actually got swelling of the joints. So you see how I took the end, the itis, right? That suffix, and I used that to develop an understanding of what the word meant, right? So I started at the end. It's swelling of. That itis is at the end. That's your suffix, right? Swelling of the joint, right? So that's what I mean when I'm talking about starting at the end. Again, we'll look at some examples right up on the slide. So don't panic if you're feeling a bit confused with that idea. It should all come together by the end of the video. So another example of a root is cardi. Cardi refers to the heart. So this is certainly one that you'll hear often in paramedicine. Dermat, referring to skin. Hemat, referring to blood. And tonsil, just as you guessed, referring to the tonsils. So here's an example of a root word that we use in English. And you've potentially never thought about this if English is your first language, but we add things to the end of root words to change their meaning in English. So we do this every day, right? So the root word that I'm using as the example here is the word dress. When we add the suffix ing to the end, we make the word dressing, which means that someone is actively dressing. They're doing that right now. Dresser, right? We can make that word by adding the suffix er to the end. And so a dresser, as most of you are familiar with, right? Somewhere that you can store clothing. Dressed, so adding the ed on the end instead, that takes it to a past tense. So somebody got dressed an hour ago, for example. So this helps people sometimes that are struggling with the idea in medical terminology of a root word and a suffix. So in this example, again, the word dress is our root word, and then we've got a suffix attached on the end of all of them here. Okay, so that example should help to increase your understanding a bit. So now here are some examples on the screen. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to take a moment and pause the video and see if you can identify the root in each of these. See if you can identify the suffix in each of these, and see if you can figure out where there are combining vowels. Not all of these words have combining vowels, so you may find that to be a bit of a challenge. So go ahead and pause the video and give that a bit of a try before we go on to the next slide. So hopefully you feel like things are coming together and you had success in identifying the root and the suffix, as well as any existing combining vowels. So as you can see up on the slide here, there's only one word that actually had a combining vowel, and that was our first word, cardiology, right? So cardi is our root. The O is our combining vowel, no meaning to that, right? Just there for sound purposes. And then we've got logi as our suffix. So you may recall that logi is the study of, right? And you may also recall that cardi refers to the heart. So in this case, what we're looking at is the study of the heart. So there's another example of where I looked at what was at the end, what that suffix was, and I used that actually before the root when I explained what it was, right? So the study of the heart. So beginning at the end when you're forming that meaning, okay? Again, here's one that we've talked about already, right? Arthritis. So you've got your root, Arthur, and then you have your itis, your inflammation. Tonsillectomy. So tonsil being your root, ectomy being your suffix. Hemiplegia. So hemi is your root, plegia is your suffix. So plegia actually refers to paralysis, and hemi, in fact, this is a prefix. So I apologize, I just called it a root, but this is actually a prefix, and this prefix means one half. So what this is telling us is there is paralysis in one half of the body. So again, looking at that final meaning and then going back and attaching it to what precedes it. So as I mentioned, right, not all words have prefixes, but they do exist. When they're included in a word, they occur before a root, and they can actually change the meaning of these roots. So some examples of that, hyper and hypo. So when something is hyper, we're thinking of that as being high. When something is hypo, we're thinking of that as being low. So, for example, hyperglycemia is referring to high blood sugars. Hypoglycemia is referring to low blood sugars. And if you want to look those words up, then you certainly can attempt to break those down in the ways that we're talking about with our other examples here. Pre and post, right? Pre is before something, and post is after. A couple other really important ones to be aware of is just the letter A. So that is an absence of, and ic, which means pertaining to. Okay, we're actually going to see an example of the A, the ic, the pre, and the hyper and the hypo in use in this presentation. So here are those examples of those prefixes being used. So hypothermia, so thermia referring to the temperature, the body, hypo, low. So this is going to be a low temperature of the body, right? And again, most of you are probably already familiar with this term from when you took your first aid, right? So hopefully you're kind of getting a bit of a comfort realizing, hey, I know some medical terminology already. I just didn't realize that I knew that, right? Hyperthermia, so that's the opposite of hypo. It's going to be a high temperature of the body, right? Preterm labor. So remember, pre is before. So this is a labor that's occurring before the term is complete, right? So before the mother has carried the baby to term, she goes into labor. Tachycardia and bradycardia. These, again, are common terms for paramedics. So tachy refers to something being sped up, and brady refers to something being slowed down. So tachycardia is actually the heart going fast, right? So a really rapid rate with the heart. Bradycardia, that's going to be a slow rate with the heart, so a slow heart rate, okay? Remember, we talked about A as being an absence of something, right? We've heard the term asymptomatic lately with COVID-19, right? We've heard that some people can present as being asymptomatic, and that this is concerning because we don't know that they actually have COVID-19 and they could potentially transmit it. So what that means is an absence of symptoms, because the prefix a means an absence of, and symptomatic means with symptoms. So it's an absence of being with symptoms. Similarly, we see the A at the beginning of the word asystole. Asystole means that there's no activity occurring in the heart. So there's an absence of activity occurring in the heart. And so you'll learn as you get into doing ECGs that that presents as a flat line on that ECG. So here's another example that I'd like to look at and just break down together with you. So hemat, this root means blood. We've got a combining vowel of O, and then we have this suffix that you've all become familiar with, this logi, right? Which means the study of. So this is where, for those of you that are visual, this is where it should really come together, this bit about starting at the end, right? So we're going to try and make some sense of this, right? We've broken down the component parts. We're going to make sense of it by starting at the end. So this means the study of blood, right? So you see, I started at the end and then worked my way through to the beginning, right? And when you have the prefixes in play, it does become a little bit of a different process, but fortunately, not all of the words have the prefixes. So again, it's just super important to get to know and commit to memory the different prefixes, so that when you see them, you recognize what they mean and you're able to adjust your understanding accordingly. So here's another example. Cholecystectomy. Okay, so in here we actually have two roots. So I mentioned earlier that we can actually have two root words. So the first one means bile or gull, and the second one means bladder. Okay, and in fact, you will sometimes see, depending on the resource that you're looking at, you'll sometimes see this all as one root. So it'll be cholecyst as one word, one root, sorry. In this example, we've broken it up in the two different ones so that you can see how we can attach the meaning. So we know that this is referring to the gallbladder, right? So gallbladder. So again, when you see this without the differentiation of there being a combining vowel in there, cholecyst, that also will refer to the gallbladder, right? It's just combining it rather than breaking it up. So now we'll go and look at the end here where we know there's a suffix. So the suffix ectomy refers to surgical removal. So you guessed it, we're going to start at the end here with our understanding, right? So we'll understand this word to mean surgical removal of the gallbladder. Okay, so again, hopefully these examples are helping things to make a bit more sense to you. One more here to just kind of deepen that understanding. And then I've got one for you guys to work on your own and see if you can come up with the meaning. So electrocardiogram. So again, something that paramedics are often involved in doing. We do electrocardiograms when we're assessing our patients, both initially and on an ongoing basis. And so the root here, elector, is referring to electricity. You can see here that we've got another root. And so this root, I'm just going to give you a minute to think about it before I tell you, because I did mention it in the presentation. So see if you can remember, what does this one mean? So it's the heart. So hopefully you got that one. So electrocardio, we know this is electricity in the heart, right? Gram, this is our suffix, right? It's at the end of the word, and that's where we find the suffix, and it means record. So we're talking about recording the electricity of the heart when we talk about electrocardiogram. So paramedics are often recording the electricity of their patient's heart. So I mentioned that there was going to be an example for you to work through. So here's a slide. I would like you again to go ahead and after I've given the instructions, pause the video and see if you could work through this on your own before I show the answer up on the screen. So the word up on the screen is gastroenterology. Okay, and what I would like you to do is I would like you to look at the roots, see if you can find, there are two roots in here, see if you can find both of them. This word does have combining vowels. See if you can find those and see if you can find the suffix. So you can go ahead and write this word down on a piece of paper and use the slashes to separate the different sections like we were on our example slides. So go ahead and pause the video and give that a try. So hopefully you're feeling some success with this and you found two root words, gaster and enter. Two combining vowels, we've got O's, one after gaster and one after enter. And then we have a suffix, which is logi. So gastroenterology. Okay, so gaster, this root refers to the stomach, right? Recall that often the roots are referring to different parts of the body. So the stomach, okay? Enter, referring to the intestines. And logi, which you're becoming very familiar with, is the study of. So this is the study of the stomach and the intestines. And so there it is broken up just with the different parts labeled. So you've got the two different roots, you have the combining vowels labeled, and then the suffix. So this is an example of a word where there is no prefix attached to it. So when you understand a root word, then you're poised to understand a lot of different medical terms because one root actually has a lot of different uses. So for example, we've got the root gaster being used in the word gastroscope and gastric, right? Now, if you look at the word gastric here, And so recall that this is referring to the stomach, right? So we've got a suffix here, IC, which actually is beginning with a vowel, right? So that's the reason that there's no O in between this suffix and this root. Whereas up here, the suffix scope, it begins with a consonant, it begins with the S, right? And so we do have a combining vowel before that, okay? Cardiac, another example of where we don't have that combining vowel in here because the suffix "ac" begins with its own vowel. It has the A, so we don't need that combining vowel in between. However, cardiology, you guys recognize this suffix logi, right? It begins with an L, so we do add that O in there, okay? Enteritis and gastroenteritis, right? So you may recall that the itis refers to inflammation. So inflammation of the intestines, inflammation of the stomach and the intestines, right? So again, an example of starting at the end and then working our way through the word that way in order to assign that meaning. So I've got another one for you to try, but don't pause your video just yet. I want to give you a couple of reminders before you try and work through the meaning of this particular word. So cholecystitis, what I want you guys to do is to see if you can figure out what this word means. But before you do that, remember that we've already established what chol and what cyst is, right? So we've got chol is the gall, cyst is the bladder, right? And sometimes these are combined so that it's cholecyst, so it's gallbladder, right? Okay. Remember, we looked at the example earlier of the cholecystectomy, right? Which was the surgical removal of the gallbladder, right? So that's our old example, okay? The next thing I want to show you guys before you get into our example is itis, right? So recall that itis is a suffix that refers to inflammation, right? You've learned that one already. So what I want you to do now is I want you to put all of that knowledge together to figure out what does this particular word mean. So now go ahead and pause the video, reflect on the information that I just gave you in the preceding slides, and see if you can decide what this word means. So again, hopefully you're starting to feel a bit comfortable with this. Here's the breakdown of the word, right? We've got the chol, we've got the vowel in here, we've got the cyst, and we have the itis, right? Now remember again that cholecyst sometimes is viewed as one root, and so this refers to the gallbladder, right? So itis, you may recall again referring to that inflammation. So if what you've got is the inflammation of the gallbladder, then you got that spot on. If that didn't make sense to you, or if you're struggling with these concepts at all, I just want to reinforce to please reach out. I'm happy to help anybody that may need any extra assistance with it. The other thing is to definitely work through the exercises in chapter 1 of your textbook, because chapter 1 of your textbook is in sync with the things that we've discussed here in this presentation. So that will help to reinforce that learning, and it may help to answer any questions that you might have. So remember as well that spelling is very important. When you get into doing electronic documentation, there will be spell checks available, but as we're doing paper documentation this semester, you're not going to have access to any spell checks. So it'll be important to have access to a medical dictionary. There are definitely ones that are available for free online. Also, keeping your medical terminology textbook handy, because it does have a great glossary at the end that lists different prefixes and suffixes. So when you're encountering new ones, you can also look them up in there. And they're arranged by alphabetical order, so it's reasonably easy to find them. So, something else that I want to really encourage you to do is as you're doing your readings for your classes, regardless of what class it is, when you encounter a new medical term that you're not familiar with, take the time to look that up. Take the time to work on committing that to memory because then it becomes part of your vocabulary. So when we're learning a new language, we at first we have a very small limited vocabulary. As we develop our skills within that language, as we get more comfortable using that language in written form, in spoken form, we develop a broader vocabulary. So the more you work at this, the more your vocabulary will develop. So, again, I just want to reinforce if you're struggling with any of these concepts, please do reach out. We can discuss it in class. I can meet with you during my office hours to provide assistance. I can answer questions through email. So, there are lots of different options for me to help you if you're struggling at all. So, please don't be scared to reach out if you need any extra clarification.